All right, as Pastor said, if you can turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And yes, like he said, didn't get as much notice, but I am very excited to be preaching tonight. And I'm excited that the Lord has given me something to preach and that he has given us his word to learn from. And I enjoy so much every opportunity I have when I get to study the word and open it and try to find the message that God communicated so long ago and that message is still relevant. It's such an amazing privilege that we have every single week where we can hear from his word. And I hope that you guys look forward to it every week as well. When we get back together, when there's the fellowship that we love and there's the singing that we love. But man, there's something about preaching. It makes me excited. And I'm really looking forward to what we have today. Now, it's a longer passage, and I was debating on whether or not I wanted to read the whole thing to start out. That's usually what I do before I start my introduction. This doesn't count as an introduction. It's like the introduction to the introduction, what I'm doing now. But usually I read, and then I do my introduction, and I debated on if that's still what I wanted to do, and I think it is. But it's going to require some intentionality because there's a lot in Ecclesiastes. I think all of us have felt that as we've been going through the book over the past few weeks. That is some dense stuff, and there's a lot that Solomon recorded all in a short amount of space. So if you'd pay attention with me, I'll point a couple things out while we go through just so we feel where the flow is. But we're going to read the whole chapter and then we'll get into the sermon. All right, Ecclesiastes 5, verse 1. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. And I really like this next phrase. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Okay, so why should we be slow with our mouth? Because God is in heaven, and because I'm in earth. In other words, God is God, and you are not, is what he's saying there. And therefore, let thy words be few. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. So that he just finished one thought. We're moving to another thought now. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow than thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thine hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there are also divers vanities. But fear thou God. Now we're moving on to another thought. If thou seest the oppressions of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Now we're not going to spend too much time on this verse specifically, because it doesn't fit into the amount of time that we have. But to suffice it to say, what this verse is saying, when you see oppression, it doesn't give to worry about it all the time. Now, you should worry about it in the sense that you want to be a help to people, but there are authorities, and those authorities have authorities, and those have authorities, and if you try to worry about all the oppression that you'd see, you'd be worrying all the time. That's basically what that verse means. Now we're moving to another thought, verse 9. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much. But the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. There is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. But those riches perish by evil travail, and he begetteth a son, and there is nothing in his hand. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so shall he go. And what hath he that hath labored? What profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? And basically he's saying all the time that this rich man has been gathering riches all of himself, all he's been doing is gathering more wind to himself. But how long can you hold a handful of wind? You can't. It's all gone, is what he's saying. This is coming from Solomon, the richest man to ever live. All his days also he eateth in darkness, and he hath much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. Now we're moving on, and we're kind of concluding that previous thought. Behold that which I have seen. It is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he hath taken under the sun of all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth and hath given him power to eat thereof and to take his portion and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joy of his heart. That's the end of the chapter. It is a long chapter. There's a lot here, and I hope that I'm able to communicate what the Lord has for us today. But before we get into that, if you'll pray with me real quick. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for your word and for the message it has for us and the opportunity you've given us to study it and to learn from it and to hear it preached. And I pray that today you might guide my mouth and guide the sermon, that it might affect those here, and that we might be ready to hear from your word. In Jesus' name, amen. There is not much worse that I know of than a puzzle that is missing a piece. Who in here likes puzzles? Anybody like puzzles? I love puzzles. I love having like one of those giant 500, 1,000 piece puzzles, and it feels so good to finish one. But have you ever been working on a puzzle? It was new, it's not been used before, and you put it all the way together, and you're only a couple pieces away, and you find the last piece, and that piece goes there, and it's all clicking together, and then you realize you're missing a piece. What do you do with it? It's so frustrating because you're so close to complete picture, but now the whole puzzle's worthless. What are you going to do with it? You're not going to frame a puzzle that's missing a piece. Now, my wife is one that she would want to keep the puzzle and save for later. I'm not, especially if it's missing a piece. It's no good. Let's throw it away. Let's get a new puzzle out. It is so frustrating. Or what about a riddle that has an answer, but you can't find it? You know that it should be obvious. It feels like it should be obvious, but there's just some piece of the puzzle that you're not getting, and it's making the riddle unsolvable. I have a riddle. What is spelled in 4 letters, sometimes 9, but never 5? Anybody have a guess? What is spelled in 4 letters, sometimes 9, but never 5? Never 5? The answer is one word. Yes. If you don't understand that, then you'll be thinking about the rest of the sermon. I'll tell you afterwards. Anyway, so there's that kind of puzzle. There's a riddle. Or sometimes you have those little physics puzzles, where you have to try to get the ball in each end of the box, and you don't know how to do it. But the trick is just to spin it or something like that. It's so obvious once you see it, but when you can't see it, it seems impossible. That's kind of how I felt when I was approaching this chapter. Because there's so much here, and I'm thinking when I'm coming to a text that we're looking for the main idea. Some people might call it, this is what I call it, is the central idea of the text. I'm looking for the main thought that God wants to communicate to us tonight. And when I was looking at this chapter, I was like, man, I do not see a main idea. There's a whole lot of ideas here, and I don't know what I'm going to preach next week. But then I found it. I was like, there it is. And I cannot wait to tell you what it is. But I'm not going to tell it to you right now. You have to listen for the rest of the sermon to find it. But it was a puzzle, man. When I was looking at this chapter, I could not figure out what ties it all together. But I found it. And that was a puzzle that I could not solve. And then I found the piece, and it fit together. But there's another type of puzzle. Have you ever been in a situation where you're just spinning your wheels and life feels meaningless and you don't know why you're doing what you're doing? And you see that a lot with people. You hear people that they get into their middle ages, they call it their midlife crisis, and suddenly they get the fear that all they've lived for is worth nothing. And then they start trying new things because they're trying to fill a hole in their life. Well, what is that hole? Well, we would all say, well, it's God, obviously. Except that same thing happens with Christians. Christians who go to church every week and who work hard and they give and they're involved in their church, they can still be in that situation where it feels like there's something missing. That something that is missing is what I want to look at today. What causes that sense where you're coming to church every week and you're involved, but it doesn't feel like it's as important to you as it used to be? It feels like you're just running through the motions. What causes that? What causes your work, where you've worked there for years, maybe decades, and suddenly it doesn't feel important anymore? What causes that hole? What's the missing piece of the puzzle? That's what I want to look at today. So Solomon starts off with, keep thy foot. So read with me again verses 1 through 3, because it's been a second since we read those first few verses. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools. For they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by multitudes of words. Okay, so what's the first thought? Take God seriously in worship and in your promises. That's the main idea of the first few verses. Take God seriously. And he starts it right off the gate when he says, keep thy foot. Now that's a weird phrase. Basically what it means is watch your step. Be careful where you're putting your feet. Specifically, be careful where you're putting your feet when you're going into the temple. So in our minds, when we think of the temple, sometimes we think of a church building, but it was a lot bigger of a deal in Israel. The temple was where everything happened for their religion. There were no temples across Israel. There was the one temple. And what he's saying is when you go into the temple, you better watch how you walk. You better watch how you act, because if you don't, you're liable to make a mistake. And this was their public worship. So he's saying when you approach public worship, which is sort of what we're doing today, it's what we would relate to it. He's saying, be careful. And he starts the verse off, and it puts a note of gravity to the whole situation that I want you to pick up on. He's saying, watch where you step. It kind of gives me the idea, of those Scooby-Doo cartoons from a while ago, and when they're walking through the haunted house and everybody starts walking super slowly and they're trying to be as quiet as possible. And that's the next thing that he says. He says, watch thy foot and be not rash with thy mouth. Slow down. Stop talking so much. Because if you keep talking, the idea is that they're going to miss something important and they might offer up a sacrifice that is evil. That's what he says in verse 2. Be not rash, in verse 3, be not rash with thy mouth, and slow down so you're not liable to make a mistake before God. That's what he's getting at, because the purpose of going to the temple was to present your sacrifice to God. It is your time to show what you have brought to God and for God to approve upon it. And if you're talking the whole time, that is liable to get you in trouble, because God is in heaven and you are not. So what does that look like for us? Well, we come to church to hear from God, but sometimes we're so caught up in ourselves that we don't give God the chance to talk to us because we're so busy. And that's what it talks about in verse 3. It says, through a multitude of business, a dream cometh. The mind keeps going and the mind keeps going. When the mind keeps going, you're missing something because you're not giving God an opportunity to talk. Now, we're not in a situation where anybody's just going to start talking and randomly in the middle of service. At least I don't think so. I don't think anybody's about to interrupt me right now. I mean, maybe, I don't know. But when our mind is going, suddenly we're not hearing from God. And I know we've all been there. I can say I've been there. Pastor's up here. He's been laboring for weeks on this passage that he's preaching to us. But our mind is not there. We're miles away. We're thinking about what lunch we had yesterday and how you don't want to eat leftovers today. So you're hoping that your spouse says we can go out today instead. And then you're thinking about work tomorrow and the stress that it's going to bring to your life. And then you're thinking about the argument you had last night with your kids and how you feel bad about that. Our mind is miles away. And we're so busy in our mind is racing that we don't give God time to talk. The passage says, beware, watch your feet, watch how you're approaching service. And the danger comes the most when it becomes a rhythm. Because I imagine that the first time anybody walked into the temple, they weren't going to be talking over everything else. It would have been a very somber experience. Your first time entering the temple, this grand thing that's built, you have the priests in their robes and you have the animals and the sacrifices being given. The first time you go, you would not be brash. You would not be rash with your words. But after it becomes a habit, after you do it over and over and over again, and this is what you do, and you come to church every week, and this is the time that we stand up and sing. This is the time that we have fellowship. This is the time where we sit down and pastor talks for a while. Suddenly, it becomes a lot easier to miss what's going on. And why? Because we have forgotten that the reason we are here is to hear from God. And we have forgotten that God is God and we are not. Therefore, we should be waiting to hear from him. How important is it for us to hear from our Creator, to hear from our Savior? And we have the opportunity to do that in our Bible reading, yes, but God gave us church to come and to hear the word preach. But so often, because it's such a habit, our minds are going a mile a minute about all the cares that we have, and suddenly we're missing that something that God has for us. How dangerous a position is that? Have you ever been trying to tell somebody something, but they keep talking over you because they feel like they know better or they have something more important to say? I've had that experience. I'm sure you have. I've probably been the other party where I'm trying to talk over somebody else that's trying to tell me something. We've all been there. Now imagine God, who is in heaven, and he has written his word because he loves you, and he has communicated it to the preacher or to whoever is trying to explain to you something from his word, but our mind is too busy that we don't have time to listen from him. That's a scary thought to think of, and we all can be there. So the answer is to watch thy foot and to remember that God is in heaven and you are not. So that's the first idea, and we have to move on to the next. The second idea, be careful with your promises. When you make a promise, keep it. So why would they be tempted not to make their promises? Well, the vows were a religious thought in their mind, and it was very common. And there was a tendency to make vows to make yourself seem more spiritual. And in doing so, they would make vows that were unkeepable to make themselves look really good. Like, I vow I will never react wrongly if somebody is mean to me. That vow is not keepable. No matter what, the next time somebody swerves out in front of you, suddenly you react badly. It's going to happen. So you should not make that vow. But these people, in an effort to look spiritual, were making promises. And it keeps going. It keeps going all the way to the days of Jesus. But they figured a way to get past Solomon's stipulation. Because there's the religious vows where you had to follow certain words, but they would find a way to cross their fingers, so to speak. They cross their fingers behind their back, and I promise I'm going to do good. But I was crossing my fingers, so I don't have to anymore. That's how they kind of were doing it. They'd say, I didn't swear by the gold of the temple. I just swear by the temple itself. And those aren't the secret words, so I had my fingers crossed. It's okay. Well, what does Jesus say about that? Jesus says, let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. Mean what you say. Do what you say you're going to do. It doesn't matter if you're crossing your fingers or not. Live with integrity. That's what Jesus says. Solomon gives a reason behind it. Because the vows were a big deal. Because it wasn't just a vow in between individuals. It was a vow made in the temple. And therefore, it was a vow made to God. And these people were making vows to God, their Creator, and suddenly they were breaking them. They stood before their Creator and they made a promise to do something, the all-powerful God that could end their life in an instant, and they didn't think he was important enough to keep it. That's what was happening. So Solomon says, whoa guys, you've forgotten something. You've forgotten to fear your God. And that's the word he uses. So let's read 4 on and let's see how he puts it. He says, when thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow than thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin, neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thine hands? For on the multitude of dreams and many words there are also divers vanities. But fear thou God. So the answer to stopping yourself from making foolish promises, he says, is to fear God. Okay, what's the fear of God? Luckily, I don't have to spend too much time here because Pastor dealt with this morning. The fear of God is the reverential awe of who God is. And if you are reverently understanding how great God is and who he is, the chances of you making a false vow are very low. If you understand who God is, suddenly the temptation to make a promise to God that you're not going to keep becomes very small. Now, you might make the vow in awe of God and in fear of God, But then suddenly, like with before in coming to church, you lose sight of who God is through the repetition. And suddenly your awe of God slips. And suddenly you're not thinking of God, and the thought to break your promise is more common. So, looking back, when thou enterest the temple, watch your feet, guard your step, because God is God and you are not. Secondly, when you make a vow, fulfill it. As Jesus says, let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. Why? Because God is God and you are not. Fear God. Stand in awe of who he is. And then he moves on. We dealt with verse 8, so we're going to move past it. But then he goes on to the idea of wealth and labor. And let me get to where I'm supposed to be in my notes. I moved way ahead. Satisfaction, this is the idea. Satisfaction is more easily found in work than the wealth work produces. That's the main idea of this section. Satisfaction in life is more easily found in work than in the wealth that the work produces. So he says, there is never enough to satisfy the greedy. That's what he says in verses 9 through 12. And he says, God made the earth to provide for everyone. There's enough here to provide for everybody that lives. But the love of wealth will never satisfy. There's enough here for everybody. But the more silver there is, the more mouths there are to take the silver, and the more that the man who's going after silver will want more and more and more of it. Now it's important to remember, money is not bad. God never says money is bad in the Bible. It's the love of money that is the root of all evil. It is the desire to keep more and more and more to yourself just to have more. It's the idea of a miser. It's the idea of wanting it's Ebenezer Scrooge who would be a miser. He wants more money, not because he wants to do something with it or help others. He wants more money because he wants more money. And there's never enough to fulfill that. And if your driving focus in life is to get more money, then you're never going to be satisfied. Then he gives an example of what this looks like. Now, I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but there is not much greater rest than you can have than after working a full day of work and knowing you did your best and knowing you provided for your family, and then you come home and hit the hay and you're out. Not a dream, no nothing, you're asleep because you are satisfied with what you did and how you provided for your family. And this is the example that he gives. He says it in verse 11, he says, in verse 12, he says, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. So for a working man, he comes home and he rests and it's sweet. It's easy because he knows that he expended himself and that he is satisfied with the work he put in and he was able to rest. But the man who's greedy, suddenly the work isn't satisfying in itself because it's never giving him enough. And all he wants is more stuff. And suddenly he has more stuff in more places, and he's now worried about all those places he has stuff. And now he can't rest easy. This is the idea he's putting. Now why can money not satisfy? He explains, money cannot satisfy because money is temporal. Let's start in verse 13. He says, there is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. But those riches perish by evil travail. That's not saying people thinking badly. It's just stuff happens. It's calamity happens. And those riches perish. They're gone. And he begetteth a son, and there's nothing in his hand. There's not enough to give on to the next generation. And as he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so shall he go. And what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? All his days also he eateth in darkness, and he hath much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. So, there is no guarantee, no matter how much money you get, if it's going to even survive a generation. You came into the world with nothing, and this is what we can count on. You came into the world with nothing, and you're going to leave the world with nothing. All you've been doing when you're trying to get wealth to yourself, you're trying to gather more wind to yourself. And when we all stand before God one day, all of us are going to have the same amount of money. Nothing. Nothing to show for it. And that's what the pursuit of money causes, is a life of solitude, which is what he pictures here, a life of misery and sickness and sadness, and at the end of it, nothing to show for it. So, all of our lives, all we are doing when we're working for money is we're trying to get a better handful of wind. It's like those cats you see that are chasing the laser. I don't know if you guys have ever done that, but you have a laser on the ground and the cat chases it. He's trying as hard as he can to get that laser, but he just can't seem to get enough. Well, the more money we get and the greater our cares are. And we say, if we just can get a little bit more, it'll be enough. But it's never enough, because the more money you have, the more cares you have, and suddenly you never have enough. And you're chasing and you're chasing and you're chasing and you're chasing, and it's never enough. So what's the answer? Well, he gives us an answer. In verse 18, read with me. He says, "Behold, that which I have seen. It is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life." And here it is, "which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God." The wealthy man and the poor man have what they have for the same reason: God's grace. God's the one that gave it to them. God has given us the gift of labor to enjoy, to do something with our lives, to make something of our lives. It is the gift of God. And if God has chosen to gift you with finances and with wealth and with resources, it is the gift of God. And we should use those for his glory. And that's a benefit of life that we have. So the answer to finding meaning in your work is not to pursue money. It's to realize where the work came from. It came from God. And therefore, our thought process shouldn't be, how can I get more money? Our thought process should be, how can I use this gift that God has given me, namely the ability to work? How can I use this gift better so I can have something to show for it for him? So, backing up, we're getting close to that's key of the puzzle here. So, a proper fear of God will prevent irreverent worship and foolish vows. That's what we saw in the first section of the passage. An awe-filled, reverential fear of God will cause one to take the worship of him seriously. If we understand who God is, or at least understand that he is greater than us, it'll cause us to take worship more seriously. And if we are aware of the greatness of our God, there should be no difficulty in praising him with all that we have when it's time to sing. There shouldn't be any desire to keep in because we're scared of what others think of us, because we're thinking about what God thinks. And God told us to sing, and we believe that he's our God, so we're going to sing because he wants us to. If we came to church with an expectation to hear from the creator of the universe and the redeemer of mankind, there should be no temptation to check out into another universe mentally. If we're coming with the mindset that we're about to hear from God, there should be no temptation to think about what you're having for a meal tomorrow or the confrontation you need to have with your boss tomorrow, because what you're worried about is right now hearing from God. If we came to church with an awe of who God is, we would be so engrossed in him that there would be no temptation to check a text or to check the score of the game that's going on, because we're engrossed in who God is. And that's the thing that's most important to us right now, because God is God and we are not, and we need to hear from him. And also, a proper understanding of God, the source of our material blessing, will bring perspective to the miser. And all of us have those miserly tendencies. It'll bring perspective to us of why we work and what we work for and why God has given us money, because of the grace of God. And because God chose to give it to us, that's why we can enjoy it. So, the secret to meaningful worship and life fulfillment is the same thing. It is the fear of God. It is the awe of who God is and what he's done for us, which creates a desire to plug into worship and to do with our labor what we can to honor him with it. That's the secret. Okay. So now we have all the answers we need, right? It's the fear of God. That's the missing piece. So tomorrow, everything should be just fine and dandy, right? Well, we have the secret. Fear God more. Okay, I'll fear God more tomorrow, I promise. Okay, so obviously that's not enough. So what do we do with this passage? What do we do about it? How do we fear God more? Respond by seeking to grow in your knowledge of who God is. Seek God and seek to grow your knowledge of God and grow your relationship with him, because the more you know of God, the greater awe you can have of him, because you understand who he is and what he's done for you. The greater our understanding of who God is, the sweeter our worship will come, and the more satisfying our labor will come, and the more satisfying the wealth that we have is, because we'll know what to do with it if we have a better understanding of who God is. Okay, where do we learn about God? Where do we learn about who God is and how he thinks and how he acts? Well, it's through the Bible, obviously. That's what he gave us. So give yourself to the Word so that you might have a better understanding of who God is, and that your awe of him will increase, and then the worship will become sweeter, and your labor will become sweeter, and suddenly that missing piece is filled in. It's not a snap. You can't suddenly have a fear of God that you didn't have yesterday, but there are steps we can take, that all of us can take, to increase our awe of God. Stand in awe of who God is by knowing more of who God is. In other words, as Jesus puts it, search the scriptures, they are they which testify of me. That's where you learn about who God is. The secret to meaningful worship and life fulfillment is the fear of God. Thank you for listening, and you may split up into your Bible fellowships.